It was one of those mornings where the world seemed to move a little slower. The lake shimmered under a veil of early fog, and the only sound was the distant call of loons across the water. I was sitting on the porch with a steaming cup of coffee, in hand, savoring the quiet that came with living away from the city. My wife knelt by her flower beds, humming softly as she pulled weeds, while my kids were inside, arguing over who had to wash the breakfast dishes before we took the boat out. For a moment, life felt untouched, like nothing in the world could disturb the calm. But if there was one person who could never stand the sight of someone else's peace, it was Karen. She wasn't just a neighbor. She was the self-proclaimed Queen of the Lake HOA. And when I say queen, I mean she acted as though the entire shoreline was her personal kingdom, with rules she created out of thin air and punishments she dished out like a tyrant on a throne. For years, she had been the source of countless disputes around the neighborhood, barking at families for the color of their shutters, threatening fines for improper mailbox heights, even sending letters about grass being half an inch too tall. To most people, she was just a nuisance. To me, she was something worse. My family's land was purchased long before the HOA ever existed, meaning their rules had no authority over me. Legally, we weren't part of their association, and that reality drove Karen insane. She thrived on control, on bending people under her thumb, and my refusal to play her game was like a thorn in her side. Say it started with her demanding dues I didn't owe. Then came the endless letters, the warnings, the fake notices shoved into my mailbox. I ignored them all, knowing she had no real power. But Karen didn't take being ignored lightly. That Saturday she showed up with something new, something she thought would finally break me. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel before I saw them. A black SUV rolled into my driveway, followed by another, and out stepped a group of men in dark uniforms. At first glance they looked official. Badges clipped to their belts, radios on their shoulders, and a leader who barked orders as if he'd walked straight out of a police academy. For a split second, I thought they might actually be real officers, here on some misunderstanding. But then I caught the details. The uniforms didn't match. One guy wore combat boots, another had sneakers. The badges, shiny as they were, looked like cheap replicas, the kind you buy in a novelty shop. Their radios never made a sound. And the so-called chief, he couldn't even pronounce my last name correctly when he read it off a clipboard. Behind them, standing tall and smug with her arms crossed, was Karen. Her grin stretched ear to ear as if she had finally cornered me. "You're in violation of community rules," she declared, her voice dripping with triumph. "These officers are here to enforce the law." I set my coffee cup down slowly, watching her with disbelief and growing anger. "The law?" I repeated. "Since when do HOA rules count as law?" One of the men stepped forward, puffing out his chest. He shoved a piece of paper at me, if you could call it that. It wasn't an official document, just a handwritten note demanding I pay overdue HOA fines. My name was spelled wrong. The signature line was blank. It was a joke. I stared at the paper, then looked at Karen. She thought this charade would scare me into submission, that I'd open my wallet out of fear. But fear wasn't what I felt. What I felt was rage. Just then, the front door opened, and my son stepped out. He had just returned home after serving 4 years in the Marines, and while he didn't say a word at first, the look on his face said it all. He sized up the men instantly, spotting every inconsistency, every flaw in their act. He leaned toward me and whispered, "Dad, those guys aren't cops, not even close." The man in front, Karen's supposed chief, shifted uneasily. As my son stepped closer, my son pointed at his holster. "No firearm? What kind of cop shows up unarmed to enforce a fine?" The man flinched but said nothing. My son turned to another. "And you, since when do officers wear sneakers with a uniform? Those look like knockoff Nikes." The impostors glanced at each other, clearly rattled, but Karen jumped in to cover their silence. "Don't listen to him," she snapped. "They're real officers, and if you don't comply, you'll be arrested." I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. Arrested? For what? Not paying your fake fees? My voice carried across the yard, and I noticed a few of my neighbors peeking from behind their curtains, phones in hand, recording everything. Karen's face turned red with fury. She had always relied on intimidation to get her way, but this time, her bluff was falling apart right in front of her. I stepped closer, close enough that the so-called officers shifted back nervously. My voice dropped low, firm, steady. These men aren't real cops. They're criminals in costume. And Karen, by bringing them here, you've crossed a line you'll never come back from. Her smug smile faltered just for a moment, replaced by a flicker of doubt. But it was too late. The act was over, and the truth was plain as day. This wasn't about rules or community or even money. This was about control, about Karen's desperate attempt to break someone she couldn't own. As I stood there, staring her down, I realized something important. For years I had let Karen's antics slide, hoping she'd eventually leave me alone. But now, after watching her drag criminals onto my property and threaten my family, I knew the time for ignoring her was over. She had made it personal. Day the fake cops came wasn't just another skirmish in our long war with the HOA. It was the day Karen went too far. It was the day she revealed who she truly was. Not a neighbor, not even a leader, but a dangerous woman willing to cross the line of law and decency just to feel powerful. And as I stood on my porch, my son by my side, staring at those imposters, I made myself a promise. If Karen wanted a fight, I was going to give her one. Only this time I wasn't going to play by her rules. The imposters were still standing there trying to keep up the act, but their confidence had started to crumble. One shuffled his feet nervously. Another kept glancing at Karen as if waiting for her to tell him what to do next. My wife had come out by then, holding her phone tight against her ear, speaking in a calm but urgent voice. Yes, they're pretending to be police officers. Yes, they're on our property. Yes, my children are here. Her words carried, and I could see the chief stiffen when he realized she wasn't bluffing. She was on the line with the real authorities. Karen's face was red, her jaw clenched so tightly I thought her teeth might break. Don't call anyone, she snapped at my wife. This is official business, and you're only making things worse. But her voice cracked just slightly, betraying the fear under her bravado. She knew. Somewhere deep down, she knew this charade had already spiraled out of her control. I stepped closer to the so-called officers, my son by my side, both of us standing firm between them and the rest of my family. You've got about 30 seconds to get off my property, I said, my voice steady. Because if you don't, you're going to be face to face with real law enforcement, and I promise you, they won't find this little costume party funny. That was when I heard it. The faint thrum of a helicopter somewhere in the distance. My heart kicked against my ribs. At first I thought maybe I was imagining it, but the sound grew louder, cutting through the morning air. Then came the wail of sirens, not just one but several, drawing closer by the second. Karen spun toward the road, her eyes wide. "What did you do?" she hissed. "I didn't do anything," I shot back. "You did." Within moments, the quiet lakefront was alive with flashing lights. Black SUVs with government plates roared into the neighborhood, followed by an armored SWAT vehicle that ground to a halt at the end of my driveway. The imposters froze like deer in headlights, their bravado evaporating as real officers in tactical gear poured out of the truck, rifles drawn, movements sharp and precise, hands where we can see them. One of the SWAT officers barked, his voice echoing with authority. There was no mistaking them for fakes. Their uniforms were flawless, their weapons real, their presence undeniable. The imposters hesitated, looking around as if maybe there was still a way to slink out of this. But SWAT didn't hesitate. Within seconds, the men were forced to the ground, their wrists zip-tied behind their backs. One tried to protest, sputtering excuses about being contracted by the HOA, but the officers weren't having it. They read charges out loud as they worked, impersonating law enforcement, trespassing, harassment, conspiracy. Karen stood frozen at the edge of the driveway, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled out of water. For the first time I saw real fear in her eyes, not the frustration of losing an argument or the anger of being defied, but the cold shock of someone realizing their power had vanished in an instant. A SWAT commander approached me, his expression firm but respectful. "Sir, we received a call about armed individuals impersonating officers. I assume those are the ones." He gestured to the men on the ground. "Yes," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Karen. "They showed up claiming they were here to arrest me on behalf of the HOA. That woman brought them." The commander turned his gaze on Karen, and for a long moment she tried to hold her ground. "I didn't know they weren't real cops," she sputtered. "I was told they were. They said they could enforce the rules." But her words fell flat against the cold reality surrounding her. The neighbors who had been watching from behind their windows were now outside, cameras rolling, documenting every second of her downfall. Her reputation as the queen of the HOA was disintegrating right there on the street, stripped bare by the flashing lights and the weight of her own arrogance. One of the SWAT officers read Karen her rights. The look on her face when the cuffs clicked around her wrists was one I'll never forget, a mix of disbelief, humiliation, and sheer panic. She twisted toward me as they led her toward the armored truck. "You did this," she spat. "You think you've won? You'll regret this." But her threats rang hollow. The woman who had spent years intimidating everyone around her had finally run into a wall she couldn't push past. She hadn't just crossed the line, she had obliterated it. And now the law was closing in. As the chaos settled, I turned back. Onto my family. My wife's hands were shaking, though she tried to hide it. My son stood tall, his jaw tight, the Marine in him still on alert even as the danger passed. My daughter peeked out from the front door, her eyes wide with the kind of fear no child should ever have to feel in their own home. I pulled them close, promising silently that I would never let anyone put them in danger like that again. The SWAT commander came back after overseeing the arrests. "We'll be filing charges," he said. "Impersonating officers is a federal crime, and if she was involved, she'll be facing some serious consequences. You did the right thing by calling us." I nodded, though the weight of it all pressed down heavy on my chest. "I didn't want it to come to this," I admitted. "I just wanted her to leave us alone." But wanting peace wasn't enough when someone like Karen was determined to wage war. That night, after the lights faded and the neighborhood fell, quiet again, I sat on the porch where the morning had begun so peacefully. The lake still shimmered, the loons still called, but nothing felt the same. The memory of those imposters standing in my driveway, threatening my family under Karen's orders, burned in my mind. Yet mixed with the anger was something else. Relief. Relief that it was over, that the weight of Karen's endless games had finally collapsed under the strength of her own arrogance. Relief that my family was safe. Relief that for once justice had stepped in and done what it was meant to do. Karen had always believed she was untouchable, that her title in the HOA gave her power beyond measure. But power built on fear is fragile. And when the SWAT team rolled in that day, it shattered. The neighbors who had suffered under her reign would never forget it. Neither would I. The day the fake cops came and the day the real ones arrived became the day everything changed. It was the day Karen finally learned that no matter how loud, how controlling, or how cruel you are, there's always someone bigger, stronger and more determined standing on the other side. And as I watched the reflection of the moon ripple across the lake, I realized one thing. Karen's war was over. Mine had only just begun.